think we are ready to get started. Welcome to our first Koinonia speaker and presentation. I'm very excited. My name is Karen Robinson, for those who don't know me. I think I know everybody. Let me introduce the other members of Koinonia. Some are here, some are on Zoom. I'm afraid to do anything here, but... Okay. Dorothy Garrett, I think she's on Zoom. Chuck Collier is here. Raise your hand, Chuck. You know Chuck. Randy Brantley, Amy Spunich, Dina Whitley, and Gabby Hollopeter, our committee. Each Sunday for several weeks, we've invited community leaders to educate us on the needs and challenges. I'm like Vern, I'm getting breathy here. The calendar will be posted in the Weekly Word and website. Before we hear from today's speaker, I have a few housekeeping tasks. First of all, each presentation will be about 20 to 25 minutes with time for questions at the end. To reach as many parishioners as possible, we'll be face-to-face with COVID protocols, live streaming, thanks to David Baxter, on Facebook and YouTube, and we also have a Zoom link, thanks to Debbie Smith, which is found in the Weekly Word. Those of you on Zoom will be muted, but you can ask questions in the chat, and Randy will monitor and ask your questions. Let us pray. God of all creation, fill us with passion for justice and dignity for each neighbor in our community. Guide and support us through Koinonia to follow your example and your command. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with you. Transform us through your Spirit to become conduits of your love and compassion in all that we do, so we become reconciled to you and your creation. In the name of the triune God, amen. Our speaker today is Angelo Dellasanti, a lifelong resident of Kannapolis and a product of Kannapolis City Schools. He received his BA in History and Secondary Ed as a teaching fellow at UNC Charlotte. His master's in school administration, also from UNC Charlotte, and he's completed his coursework for his doctorate in educational leadership from Charlotte. He served 5 years as a history teacher, 2 years as an assistant principal, and 8 years as a principal, most recently at A.L. Brown High School in Kannapolis. He has received numerous educational awards through the years, having been named the Rowan Salisbury Schools Principal of the Year in 2018, as well as earning the Philip Morris Fellowship for the Outstanding Student in the Educational Leadership Doctoral Program at UNC Charlotte. Angelo currently serves as a Leadership Solutions Strategist with the Flipping Group. His primary job is to work with principals, directors, and superintendents to create better schools for students to learn and grow. He has been married to his wife, Casey, for 14 years. His sister, Nicole, is here with us, and he enjoys reading, writing, golfing, and cooking. Today, he'll speak to us about the challenges and needs, successes, and status of public education in our community, especially during these difficult times. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Angelo Dellasanti.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. A couple housekeeping things that I'd like to address before you get going. I can ramble, and I trust Debbie Smith a lot. So, Debbie, if you would do me a favor, and when I've talked for 20 minutes, regardless of what I'm saying, just stop me, okay? This is an incredibly complex subject, I think, but one that is very important. and so I will try and weave it together as well as I can. The second thing that I want to say is thank you. I had the opportunity to thank you to this church, All Saints, not for having me here today, but a couple years ago, right before the pandemic started, I had the opportunity to come visit for several weeks in a row. And I was just struck by the love and care of this church. And since then, I'm not a member here, but since then, I continue to receive outreach from the church, outreach and care. And I just think this church has an incredible heart for people, has an incredible heart for outreach. And so I have been the beneficiary of that. And so when I was asked if I would come and do this today, I really wanted to say yes from the very first second I was asked, but had to think about it a little bit, and I'll address why that is in just a moment. Really quickly, I won't go over all the stuff that was on the slide. Karen, thank you so much for that introduction. I think probably what I want to say about who I am is that education, I think, really saved my life, saved my sister's life. And I mean that in the most serious sense of the word. We come from a home that was absolutely full of love and that was absolutely broken. We moved down here after doing a few of our first years in elementary school. Got down here toward the end of elementary school. Parents promptly divorced. Have a father who is a functioning alcoholic, who is a truck driver, road driver, so would leave Sunday afternoon, come home on Friday, drink himself to sleep in a chair. We'd all get up and we'd work very, very hard on Saturdays, cleaning the house and cleaning the yard. We'd go to church on Sunday morning. Dad would leave again. Mother graduated from high school at the top of her very small class, I understand, but quickly took a secretarial job, met my father, and had a very, very, very dysfunctional relationship. If you have any idea what ACE scores are, my ACE score, I believe our ACE score, is a 9 out of 10. But there are also resiliency scores. And for that, we get a perfect 15 out of 15 because there were wonderful people who loved us. And bringing us back to education, Kannapolis City Schools is where we landed. I think we were well taken care of during that time. People saw things in us, believed in us, would not allow us to give up when we wanted to, always made us take the road that was a little bit harder and more challenging. I know that when I first came down here, I wasn't placed in any kind of honors or gifted classes, but my teachers immediately saw potential that was within me and fought for that and had that changed. And so I am immensely grateful. High school is where I decided that I was going to become a teacher after thinking that I was going to go into the Navy or maybe pursue a career in law. One of the things that I knew was that I had to get a scholarship in order to attend college. And so that's what I did. I attended North Carolina as a teaching fellow, and I've been in education ever since. So with that, I want to get into the disclaimers that are in front of us today. I should have probably changed that first one. Originally, that was my goal, to kind of touch on all the various challenges that exist within education. And as I was putting this presentation together, I kind of kept coming back to the same root issues. And I think for those root issues, we are going to try to cover as much breadth as we can today rather than go into depth. I assume that some questions will come and we'll go into a little bit more detail. But the honest truth is that dissertations have been written on every single one of these subjects and will continue to be written on these subjects for years to come. So we will only be scratching the surface today. The second thing is I want to acknowledge that I am absolutely 100% a wounded educator. I never thought that I would leave education. I don't think in a perfect world I ever would have left education. But as I told my staff, and as I've told many people since my resignation, and transference over into the flipping group, I'm very, very tired. I struggle a lot. I was talking to Chuck before I came in here. I struggle with the idea that I quit on students. I struggle with the idea that I quit on my staff. I don't foresee myself going back into the school building or working in school administration in any capacity moving forward. But maybe one day, a long time from now, I'll get back into educational policy making. And for the time, I'm trying to mend my heart, working with principals, superintendents, leaders, to help them create better schools. I do think I know something about that, and hopefully I can use my talents there. And I have addressed the time issue, so we will move forward. Funding. I think it's really important. When we talk about problems in education, we're always talking about money, right? That's the root of it. If you follow the Leandro case, North Carolinian students have the right to a sound basic education. And when you look at the amount of underfunding that's gone on over the course of the past several decades, we're short to the tune of about $6 billion that should have been spent on education. So when I was looking up statistics for this, we look at funding level, which is how much money North Carolina spends on education. And so it's about $11,000 a year, with the average being about $14,000. So when we take a look at it, North Carolina ranks 47 out of 51. If I were to ask you in the audience, so let's get some audience participation, where do you think North Carolina ranks in terms of GDP? Where do you think North Carolina ranks as a state in terms of GDP? So if we're 47th in terms of educational funding, we'll just do a show of hands. If you think we're in the bottom quarter of states, so the 75th percentile and lower, raise your hand. Some votes there, 50th to 74th. Somewhere in the middle, but on the low side of the middle. Okay? 25th to 50th, middle, but slightly higher. And in the top, 25%. How about top 10%? Okay. We rank 9th. North Carolina has the GDP for North Carolina in 2021 was $594 billion. That's right below New Jersey. New Jersey, on average, is spending $23,000 per student per year on their education. Thought a lot about how to explain this, and the best way that I can put it is, imagine if our students had twice the resources. Imagine if our students had twice the resources. Imagine if teachers had half the class sizes. Imagine if EC students had twice the access to specialized curriculum and specialized teachers to help them grow through those disabilities, despite those disabilities. The reason I honed in on New Jersey is because that's where I'm going to be doing a lot of the work of this job. So I'll be in North Carolina and New Jersey. And so I'm curious to see what that is and what that looks like. On the surface, there's a lot. Funding effort, how much a state funds compared to its wealth. So I intentionally asked that question before we got to this slide because we ranked 49 out of 51. You would expect that with the funding level at 47 and a GDP of 9, you would expect that our funding effort is fairly low. Teacher pay, or funding distribution. North Carolina prides itself in its ability to say that we get a lot of equal access to school districts, LEAs, across the state. And so we have a huge pot of money. That money basically gets equally distributed. We take Title I funds, which come from the government. We spread those out, all kinds of title funds, and we spread those out based on students' needs across the state. One thing that kind of gets missed in all this is a low wealth formula. Anybody have an idea what the low wealth formula is? So it basically says, hey, we're going to give LEAs money or counties money in order to supplement their education. But in order to do that, there's a formula they come up with. So a county that qualifies gets more money because it's low wealth. The problem is, if you're a county that doesn't have any growth and you're not meeting what the state says is your responsibility, then you get none of that extra funding. It's really easy to get a picture of North Carolina that's very suburban and urban and maybe a little bit rural when you live in Cabarrus County and Rowan County. You get a very different picture of North Carolina when you drive east and when you drive east to the Outer Banks. There's nothing for miles and miles and miles once you pass Raleigh. So all of this comes to teacher pay. When adjusting for inflation, North Carolina teachers make on average about 8.75% less than they did 20 years ago. This is the reason why so many teachers get out of education. I actually took some time this morning to try to look up some statistics on what it would take to get teachers back in education. I guess I shouldn't say it that way. I basically took a first-year teacher salary, which is $36,000. There are some supplements that are available in Kannapolis and in Cabarrus County. Those are great supplements, about 10%. But what I would also say is there are many districts across the state that don't supplement teacher pay. And so because of that, we're just going to go with the $35,000 number. An entry-level analyst at the bottom 75th percentile, so take basically any math major who can go and do that job, comes in at about $47,000 to start the year. In about 5 years, that same person makes about $70,000. The top of the teacher pay scale in North Carolina is $54,000. That's the top. That's after many years of not getting a raise, after 20, and then some bonuses at year 25. That gets you to $54,000. So if you're to continue down that road, a biologist, entry-level biologist in North Carolina would start at about $59,000 a year. Entry-level chemist would start at about $61,000 a year. So we have these areas of high need, math, science, EC, and we have no practical way to attract those people to come into education. And that's the point of my next slide, the teacher pipeline and teacher quality. So we have about 10% fewer students graduating from teacher prep programs than we did a while ago. What I'll also say, this PowerPoint is going to be made available to you. Everything in bold is a link, so that's where the stats will come from. You will have the opportunity to access those at that time. The other thing that I didn't put in here is that teacher resignations are relatively stable. So we have about 1.7%. We have a few thousand teacher positions down across the entire state, about 100,000 teachers. Averages can be misleading. Averages can be misleading because the vast majority of our state is rural farmland. Rural farmland where people tend to come back to after they graduate from college, and they tend to stay. And so when you look at these vacancies, a lot of these vacancies are in areas, that 10% is distributed in areas that are suburban and rural, and not so much in across the vast majority of the state. That's why we see so many numbers high right now. Shortages, teachers in all grades for math and special education, teachers in every level of elementary. And this was a really interesting statistic, I believe, from the National Education Association. We project that over the course of the next decade, we're going to be 77,000 high school teachers short across the country. 77,000 high school teachers short. That was an astonishing number to me. And so the result, there's a lot of results, but the one that we're dealing with today is teacher class size. My school, prior to me leaving A.L. Brown High School, we were short 6 positions when I left. We have a wonderful program, a wonderful access to curriculum that we would like to put our freshmen through called Lead Worthy. It gives them soft skills, socio-emotional skills, skills that we know are critical in order to be successful in the world today. My school prior to that, Jesse Carson High School, we were putting about half of our freshmen through that when they entered. There was no way to do that because there's no space in the master's schedule. If you're down 6 teachers, those students have to go somewhere. And so 6 teachers at 3 classes per semester, that's 18 and 36. That's 36 sections short of what we probably should be teaching across the school year. That means math class sizes in some cases go from mid-20s to low 30s. That means some elective courses that kids need in order to graduate from high school because they don't plan on going to college, they plan to pursue a career in a trade. That means sometimes they don't get to take those classes. That means tightening everywhere and more work for teachers. It's a sad state of affairs. Massive turnover in educational leadership. Because of the challenges we're talking about today, what we're seeing is a lot of superintendents and a lot of principals who are resigning. We're expecting about a 30% turnover in superintendencies over the next few years, 30%. What I will tell you is I've had at least 50 conversations with educators since I left my position, or since I announced that I was going to leave my position about a month and a half ago. Those are all people from around this area. Those are all people who are trying to figure out, how do I do something else? It's too taxing. I'm too tired. These range from school principals. Matter of fact, I was having the same conversation with a member of the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction on Thursday. I was saying that school principals were reaching out to me. In the middle of our conversation, my wrist vibrated, my phone went off, and it was a local high school principal saying, "I'm done. Tell me how to do what you do." That was in the middle of our conversation. So people are looking everywhere because of the complexities that we'll talk about on the last slide. I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to skip forward. According to the NEA, 55% of teachers are considering leaving earlier than normal. So that should just bolster what I just said, really. So it's not just principals, it's not just superintendents who are considering leaving the profession. There's a lot of teachers who are considering leaving the profession as well. We have a mental health crisis. This data are made available from the beginning of the pandemic. This is the first 6 months of the pandemic. We've been in the pandemic a lot longer than 6 months. So anywhere from 11 to 60% of our students are dealing with great distress, anxiety and depression, 60%, anxiety and depression. We see that in schools all day long. Kannapolis City Schools this past year began a teletherapy partnership with Atrium, where students could receive teletherapy, telemedicine within schools. Fantastic program. And I can't tell you the number of times that I recommended that to parents as a resource over the course of the first 6 months we had access to it. Student behavior, especially violent behavior, is soaring. All you need to do is watch the news with respect to gun violence, shootings. These are getting closer and closer and closer to home. As an educator, you never want those things to happen. You prepare for those things to happen. But I do think somewhere in your mind you think that's not going to happen here. I no longer think that way. I now wonder when it's going to happen. I now wonder when it's going to happen, and I worry about how bad it will be. This isn't to say that all discipline is going through the roof everywhere. This is to say that violent disciplinary actions are up. We don't have data on this yet because it's really just been this past year, this past 6 months, so the data hasn't been cleaned on this. But if you were to Google it, you would find article after article after article after article from California to the coast of Massachusetts that says we're seeing a real problem with violent behavior in school with students. And that takes its toll on teachers. That makes teachers say, I'm not sure that I want to do this. And then with the time that I have remaining, are you stopping me at 20 or 25? 25, so that means I have like 3 minutes to go through this slide. Okay. I worried a lot about putting this slide in here, to be perfectly honest. To ignore this slide is to ignore the reality of the present situation facing educators and education all across this country. I struggled with individual bullet points that I put on this slide. The first one, I figured I'd tackle it head on, is the presidency and the American public. I believe, personal belief, that the president, hopefully, most of the time should represent decency. And should, again, most of the time, nobody's perfect, be above reproach. It's difficult as an educational leader. It's difficult, I think, as a leader of people in general, when you see the president or politicians or people in power repeatedly doing things that you would be fired for in a heartbeat. That's challenging. We move on to the political situation in Washington and the events that have taken place over the course of the past several years. The January 6th Capitol riot. You look at the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And not so much the acts, but the rationalization that those things are okay. That those things are not systemic. And when you live in an area that we do, I'll just say Kannapolis City Schools, I don't know what the demographics of Cabarrus County schools are, but if you were to look at Kannapolis City Schools, 34 to 35% of the students are Hispanic. 33% of those students are black. That's the vast majority. And so, when these things happen, and educators and people and society don't speak on them, or we do speak on them and we rationalize them, and we point to things that don't have anything to do with the situation that they face because of the color of their skin on a daily basis, we can't expect people to not be resentful of that. We can't expect people to not notice that. That is something that is pervasive. And I think that our students, especially our high school students, see that. I think our families see that. When we look at school board meetings and policies, again, this is just, it's coming down the pipe, right? Like I started at the presidency, then I took a look at how we're responding at the national level, and then you take a look at school board meetings. If you are on social media, we talk about popcorn during those school board meetings because of the entertainment value. And what I would say is that's a sad state of affairs because it shouldn't be about that. It should be about students. But everything has been politicized. These masks have been politicized, even though we know that masks in schools keep kids safer than just about anything else. They're extremely effective. The data shows that time and time again. Not that I enjoy wearing them, and I don't suspect that any of you really enjoy wearing it either, but it is effective. I have 1 minute, so probably 30 seconds now. So socio-emotional learning for students. Socio-emotional learning, that's a curriculum that we need, that our students need in order to be successful in life. That is currently being tagged as an extension of critical race theory and indoctrinating our students. I hope you see the connection here is teachers just trying to give students successful tools, or tools to be successful in life, and then being told you're indoctrinating them into a liberal ideology that's taxing on teachers on top of everything else that I've mentioned that they're going through today. The last thing that I'll say, I didn't put links on this slide because I think we're all pretty familiar with what's going on, and I didn't want to lead you to any one specific place. But the one thing that I will say, and I'll close here, is policy making and ignorance. When I began my journey into educational leadership in 2010, there's a North Carolina policy book. There's a North Carolina educational law book that was about that big in 2010. That book is about this big now. And it's the codification of educational law in North Carolina. Being prescriptive to the point where you must name this class this thing. Being prescriptive to the point of, we want instructional, this hasn't been passed yet, but instructional plans need to be placed. Not curriculum. Curriculum is online for everybody to see. The standards are there. But there's a new push for, teachers to post everything that's going to be used in a lesson, which, to be totally honest, can't really be done unless you're going to script it. And at that point, you might as well just put everything online and sit people in front of a computer. I'll say this because I don't think that our legislators are bad people. I think they have a ton of stuff to do, and they don't know what they're actually passing. I had the opportunity to sit down with about 6 of them in a principal group that I led prior to leaving, and we were talking about principal and teacher pay and the fluctuations that could occur. One of them was on the finance committee. We explained that a school principal could see a $10,000 or a $20,000 swing in 1 year based on the school's performance, or if they left their high-performing school to go to a low-performing school. The person had no idea what we were talking about. So I think oftentimes we're just voting along political lines for expediency and not really looking at the ramifications and the impact that they have on real people, real students, real teachers, every single day. That brings me to the end of this presentation. Again, I struggle because you can drill down so deeply into so many of these, and we can talk about things that I didn't include on here, like how calendar laws deeply affect North Carolina and performance, and how grading scales are reflective of affluence in the community or poverty in a community and not actual teacher quality. But I'll save those conversations for a different time and individual places, and I welcome any comments that you might have or questions that you might have at this time. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just want to applaud your courage in putting up that last slide and saying out loud what is on the minds of everybody, whatever political side they're sitting on. And you had some stuff in here that really stunned me. I grew up in Connecticut a long time ago. I remember my grandparents being on the school board, and they talked about school issues, children's issues, and my grandfather would be rolling over in his grave if he were verbally assaulted the way that some parents are behaving in school board meetings. And where I think that it's good for parents to have input into education, I don't think as parents we're qualified, and we don't have the right as parents to say, my child is only going to learn this, and they're not allowed to learn anything else. And that doesn't help society as a whole. So thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Hi, Courtney Steinberg. I have a 5-year-old who will be entering Cabarrus County Schools next year. So I'm quite involved. If folks don't know, I'm very involved. I plan on being at another school board meeting on the 14th in case anybody is interested. As a parent, what can we do to help you as an administrator and as a teacher? What is the best thing parents can do for you to make our kids more successful and help in the classroom as much as possible?
There's probably a lot of ways to go with that answer, too. I think trust. You know, just about every single educator I know got into education because they want to help kids. And I think that the vast majority of educators right now feel deep mistrust from the public. And so I think trust would be one answer. I think another one is to be involved. I was in a meeting a few months ago, and there was a parent who was asking, and it was not a meeting for my school, by the way, but there was a parent who was asking, you know, how can I get this information? And the folks who were in the room kind of went around giving various answers to that. One that wasn't given pretty readily was that the information is there. Most schools, I don't think every school equally, but most schools do a really great job of getting that information out. I think most schools at this point, post-pandemic virtual instruction, I think it's really easy to hop on and see what your kids are doing in school. Again, that doesn't mean that there's a script of, you know, every single thing the teacher said in class, but they have it's really easy to get an idea of what's happening in your kid's classroom because everything's posted online. And so proactively, you know, just keeping up with that and being invested and involved in your child's education, I think is another huge thing. I think alongside of trust, encouragement. I think things are really tough right now. And that's not just because teachers feel mistrust from the public, or sometimes they feel a lack of gratitude from, you know, students. I think sometimes it's just they need a pat on the back. You know, we do Teacher Appreciation Week in May. That's crazy. You know, Teacher Appreciation Week should have the support of the public at all times. So we should constantly be having Teacher Appreciation Weeks. It doesn't have to be anything big. I don't think this requires a significant financial contribution. Those are probably, you know, great too. You know, a gift card to get some Starbucks would be great. But I think just a letter like, thank you. You know, thank you for investing in my kid. That's the stuff that educators post about on social media. They don't post about the gift cards and, you know, the Christmas gifts that come when they do, or the Teacher Appreciation Week stuff that comes. They post when somebody takes notice that they've cared for their child. They say, thank you. That means a lot to me. So I think trusting, I think keeping up to speed with what's happening, I think encouraging them, and then I think just advocating for them exactly like what you're doing. It can be a really difficult place for a teacher or a principal to advocate for themselves or each other in light of the political state that we're facing. And so I do think that there's effort needed for people who are outside of education to advocate as much as they possibly can. Thank you.
I'll take this question and then over to that person. Kathy?
You have such a breadth and depth of this topic. And so I ask you, instead of my saying just, oh, wonderful, you just go fix it, all this that you've mentioned. What would you, and other than the things you just told Courtney, what areas would you tell those of us, and we're here because we care and would like to make a difference, where do we start locally, statewide, nationally, neighborhood. We want to help, we want to make a change, but I don't know where to start.
You're talking about something that I struggle with intensely. But we have a two-party system. There are Republicans and there's Democrats, and a lot of people get lost in the middle. But we have a Republican and a Democrat system. And, I think change happens when people vote. I have a really close friend who's an educator who says everybody supports education, but nothing changes when it comes to how we vote. And I think that's because, the way that we've structured the codification of our society, we have to vote for things in packages. And we have to vote for people who have much different beliefs than we might personally, but people who have to put education into one of two camps. It's either a liberal, thing, or it's a conservative thing. I think every liberal and conservative and Republican and Democrat would say that they support education, and they see the changes or they see the challenges, fundamentally differently. But I don't think that the vast majority of people vote on education. I think the vast majority of people vote on things that are much closer to their heart. One-issue voters, such as, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. A conversation I've had with a lot of folks is, how do we divorce education from these other issues? I don't know that we can. I don't know. I feel really, I feel so much of a lack of confidence with trying to answer your question, because I think they're tied into things that people view as greater than education. Even though everybody values education, there are things that are far more important to a lot of people than education, especially if you don't have a child in the system. But I think we have to talk. I think we have to use our voice. I think we have to speak up. I think anytime we see an opportunity for a conversation or an action, we take it as much as we can and as boldly as we can. And I don't know where it goes from there, to be perfectly honest. I know that to fix it is going to require everybody in this room, and it's going to require everybody beginning to work together and to listening to one another. I think what I've presented here today is a view on education. I know that some of what I said is probably woefully wrong and inaccurate. I like to think that I have within me the capacity to sit down with somebody that I disagree with greatly and listen to them and value their humanity and say, tell me what you think, and make the conversation about the ideas rather than the people. And I think so often we attack the person, we don't listen to the person, we vilify them, and we're unwilling in our own hearts to come to any kind of a compromise. And that's with so many things in life, right? Not just politics. But with everything. And so if we come to these conversations with certainly points to bring and an agenda, but also with a posture of humility, and people on the other side of the conversation come to it that way as well, I think we can hopefully start to get some traction. And if we can't, then we are far worse off than I thought we were. But I think there's some personal humility involved. Personal courage and personal humility to have those conversations, to engage, but then also the humility to accept that we're not going to get everywhere we need to get tomorrow. This reminds me of a book that I would encourage. It's not educational. It's called Factfulness. It's by Hans Rosling. So he is a researcher who passed away recently, is published a few years ago. But it talks about, our perception of reality and what reality is. And so often it's either or when it can be and. That's probably the single greatest lesson that I got from that book. There's so many wonderful lessons about operating in a world of factfulness, but one of them is that it doesn't have to be either or. It can be and. And I think as we embrace the and, we might be able to break through some of these echo chambers that we seem to be stuck in.
Mark, I'll be right with you. We have one back here.
Hi. My concern is I don't think we have access to some of the schools. I was my husband and I were very strong volunteers in the elementary system, and then it absolutely stopped at middle school. And I was so disappointed to see that. I mean, I literally did not see the inside of that middle school except for a play and an award ceremony at the end of the year. Now it's at my two grandchildren are at West Cabarrus. I've been on the soccer field. I have not been inside their high school. And to get back to when I was a strong volunteer, I would volunteer like 3 or 4 hours a week. And I would come out of there and say, oh my God, I'm exhausted. How do these teachers do this day in and day out? And you see all the situations and the circumstances they have to deal with. And so I gained such an appreciation. And I would like for that to continue, for people to see, and maybe you wouldn't have these violent outbursts at some of the meetings because they'd have more of an understanding, especially with regard to the low income of our teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just in terms of parents being in schools, I think generally as students get older, they want their parents there less and less in terms of the academic setting. I also think it begins to mean something different, right? When your parents are there in high school, why is your parent here? Like if they're not dropping off lunch money, which they don't need to do anymore, everything's automated. So, you don't have money in your account, I'll just throw it on there. Or, in our school district, every single student eats for free. So so unless you're getting a bag dropped off very quickly in the office, then why is your parent here? So I think students want that space, and I think as educators, we try to give it to them. And I don't know whether that's right or wrong. What I will say is about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, I had a parent who showed up out of the blue, wanted to go eat with their kid in the lunchroom. Like, passionate, right? Like, hey, I want to have lunch with my kid today. They're in 11th grade. I don't know that your 11th grader wants you in there. It also, as students get older, they are less and less supervised in a school. As we get older, we're less and less supervised in life. That's the natural order of things. And so in a school, specifically in the classroom or in the hallway, there's always going to be a teacher with basically every single student unless they're using the restroom at an elementary school. In high schools, there's a much greater degree of freedom. And so with that greater degree of freedom is, access to students, conversations not with your own child, but with other children that parent hasn't given you permission to speak with that child for any reason. So I do think it is more complicated to get parents into schools as students get older and older and there's less and less supervision. But what I would say is that most schools, I think, would welcome parents and community members as volunteers in specific roles. I think where that gets challenging, and I'm just going to be totally honest here, I think where that gets challenging is it's almost sometimes not worth our time because there's so many people who say they will, and then you go through the steps to get them to do it, and then they don't. And so it's just easier if we did it ourselves to begin with and didn't get anybody's hopes up. That being said, there's volunteers in every school. They do a great job. So I would say volunteer that way, in the front office.
We have about 5 minutes, so I know I have 2 more questions here. Start with you.
Angela, Mark Robinson, thanks for being here. Karen and I grew up in Killingly, Connecticut as well, and there education is done by town. At least it was when we were there years and years ago. Here in North Carolina, it's by state. Do you know of any other states with similar geography? And I understand part of why we do it by state is because otherwise the East would die if it was by county. Do you know of any states that are doing it well at a state level? Any examples that we might look to be better than, or fund better, or the problem is there an exemplar we could look to and preach to our leaders in education?
Yeah, I'd be hesitant to name a state because I haven't studied that specifically. I think the core, maybe, of what you're getting, at least of what I'm interpreting the question to be, so forgive me if I interpret it the wrong way, is, how do we get money to where it's needed? How do we appropriately invest in education? And I do think that there is a balance that needs to come from the state because education is a state right? It's not a federal thing. Generally, it's not a federal thing. So there needs to be some level of equality and representation across the state. But I also think that there needs to be a balance because, as you said, in Connecticut, there's a lot of local funding, right? So high property taxes. So if you're in a in an area of high affluence, you tend to have more resources in your schools. So North Carolina tries to steer away from that. Oftentimes to the detriment of getting students what they do need. And I think what it comes back to is how much do we want to invest in education? How high of a priority is it? I don't know which states are doing that better. I do know that if you follow the links that I put in here, there's one model in terms of funding effort and how that's changed over time. There are states toward the top of that where we've regressed by percentage points. They have gained in percentage points, but that just means that they're putting more money into it. It doesn't mean that what they're doing with the money is great. California has the largest GDP, the largest economy of any state in the country. And they're not number one when it comes to funding effort or even results. So I think that's where it has to be nuanced to what the state itself needs, because at a certain level, throwing money at it has diminishing returns. As we all know, you can be irresponsible with money. What I do know in North Carolina right now is that we're at a deficit to the tune of $6 billion for what a basic sound education is for a student who's not getting any supplemental funding somewhere, across the east side of the state. So I think the answer from North Carolina right now is we have to make a decision to invest in education because we have not done that.
Okay, our last question.
Thank you, Angelo, for your presentation. My name is Jim Williams. One thing that I wonder if we couldn't do with our elected officials is to begin to show that education is probably one of the most powerful economic development tools that they could be investing in. Imagine if any of our counties, to speak to Cabarrus County, if we had a reputation of being the best school district or the best school system in the state, there would be companies and individuals flooding into this area and investing in this area, which is typically what our legislators want to see happen. Do you know, are there studies showing that when you invest in education, your economic development, the quality of life standards for that community increase? Because those are the issues that it seems to get legislators' attention. It's more difficult to get them passionate about something when maybe their constituents aren't invested in public schools because their kids are out of school or whatever else it might be. So again, my question is, do you see any link there, and are there discussions around that point?
Your question operates from the fundamental understanding that a rising tide lifts all ships. That assumes that everybody everywhere, especially those in positions of power, want all ships to be raised. I wish that I could say that everybody wants that. I don't think we're at a place societally that everybody wants all the ships to be raised. I think that in general, and I don't mean policymakers, I mean we human beings, right? We make decisions that tend to benefit us. And so what benefits us the most? I mean, where there's not a shortage of money is in politics. How do we get money in politics? We get money in politics by making deals and making agreements, and there's a quid pro quo system that's been set up so that I'm going to support you if you support this thing, which then enhances my business, regardless of whatever else it destroys. So I would like to say that people would be open to that, right? Like our legislators should be open to the idea of, educating everyone at a top tier level so that our society on the whole improves. I would also argue that our legislators and the people that some of them surround themselves with don't see their lives aren't impacted by the quality of education in inner city Charlotte. To any degree at all. And so, again, if I'm going to make the decision to pull resources away from my constituents to help everyone, then everyone has to have that idea. And I think I know that we're in a polarized society, and it's not, I wish we were more altruistic. I wish that what you said could happen on a more regular basis. I would like to think that people would be open to the idea. I don't know what specific studies there are. I do know that there are far more equitable models in the world than the one that we have. Those are also far more homogeneous models, or homogeneous populations. But I do think that there are models out there that show when you take care of people with respect to their health, when you take care of people with respect to their education, and you give everyone truly equitable and appropriate and quality access to those things, I think we've seen those nations thrive. And I think we come up with a lot of excuses to say why that wouldn't work here. But I do think with what you're asking, I think that presupposes that everybody wants that. And I'm not convinced that that's the case, unfortunately.
Well, our time has expired. Thank you, Angelo. I really we all appreciate your insight. I'm hoping Angelo can stick around just a few minutes for anyone who didn't get their question asked. We did monitor the chat, and we didn't have any comments or questions at that point. Up next week, our presentation will be from Susan Caudle, who is with the Culture and Life Center. She'll be talking about elder care and the challenges of the elderly. So I hope you all can come back. Remember, we're hybrid, Zoom if you can't, live stream, and we are posting all of these things on the website in addition to all of the slides that Angelo provided us. Thank you all, appreciate it. It was very, very informational, Angelo. Thank you. Have a good week.